everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of the Retro Ups and Downs. Now, we're getting a little bit more modern with the ups and downs because we have brought you everything, asterisk, from Where No Man Has Gone Before through to Broken Bow, which was of course the first episode of Enterprise. The wee little asterisk is that we are still bringing you the ups and downs for the Cage, but not quite yet. As we know, there was a big gap between Enterprise and the next TV show, which is Star Trek Discovery. We are going to go through all of the ups and downs for the opening episodes, The Vulcan Hello and Battle of the Binary Stars. Will you join me, please, for all of the ups and downs for Star Trek Discovery Season 1, Episodes 1 and 2, The Vulcan Hello and Battle of the Binary Stars. I do want to lead with an up. Visually, this show is stunning. Whatever about the aesthetic change between prior Star Trek and this version of Star Trek, it actually looks gorgeous for the most part. The way that they create the vastness of space, the way that they create the planet on which Burnham and Giorgio are walking, the way that they are able to give scale is so well done. When it comes to the visual effects, they did not skimp when it comes to Discovery. And I think, I might be wrong, but I'm fair if I am wrong, I think some of the hesitation with how Discovery looks is the design changes as opposed to how they're actually presented on screen. That would be my opinion. Bear that sentence in mind. So, the redesign of the Klingons, because we open up with T'Kuvma delivering this speech that eventually will lead to the phrase, remain Klingon. This is set before the original series, and we know how they were presented in the original series. Now, I have gone on record many times saying I am not a fan of how the Klingons were presented in the 60s. I try to be, look, it was the 60s. It was a different time. Presentation of a bunch of Caucasian actors in blackface, it doesn't fly today. I have no issue whatsoever in not doing that. Make it make sense for the story. So, the idea of reimagining the Klingons, I don't mind. And the idea of making them isolationist, I don't mind. The idea of T'Kuvma, I don't mind. In fact, the idea is an up from me. The design is what's a down. To say they went a bit too far. The redesign from the original series to the movies was radical. And people are on the record going, oh, it was money. As soon as we had money, we put prosthetics on them. So, it's not that anybody was precious about how they looked in the 60s. So, which is why we got the redesign then. And then we got the redesign. It was a much more gentle redesign, but that redesign from the movies into the next generation. As I say, much more gentle because they had the ridges. They had them in the motion picture, but they definitely had them in The Search for Spock. So this is a heck of a redesign, the logic being the same, but they are far so over the top, to the point where, what was the point? Even on that, I can say, well, the point is we want to make them very alien and we want to make them a completely different society and we want to make them quite, that there is no understanding at this point in history between Starfleet and the Klingons. Again, now I would put that in with the idea behind everything. But then it's trying to reconcile, you told me this was in the prime timeline. There's been many theories since about these Klingons. And it makes me think of a line from Picard, which I actually quite enjoy, which effectively highlights the difference between the V-headed Romulans and the smooth-headed Romulans. You have Laris just flicks one and says, oh, well, he's a northerner, what did you expect? Brilliant. Great. That explains the fact that there are difference in evolution, different looking people on the one planet. Great. I have seen kind of retroactive explanations for these Klingons going, the Klingon Empire is vast. These are not necessarily the Klingons that we came to know on Kronos. And that actually, in terms of headcanon, I don't mind that. I think, okay, if the Klingon Empire is analogous to the Federation, it isn't, but go with it for a moment. Does that mean then that they are Klingon by designation? or Klingon by evolution, and it's open to interpretation. If this sounds like I'm doing a bit of mental gymnastics, I've been kind of thinking about this since 2017. I do not hate in any way that the Klingons do not all look the same. In fact, I think it's much better that they don't all look the same. Humans don't all look the same. But I remember hitting play on the Vulcan Hello in 2017 and going, holy mother of... People probably remember that photo that came out ahead of as well. I think it might have been a lot to drop on people in the opening scene of the Vulcan Hello. The speech that T'Kuvma delivers that ends with the great lie, we come in peace. The way that that's presented, I understand this version of the Klingons straight away, or certainly T'Kuvma. This idea that, we are not one happy quadrant. We are not all here to make friends, and we are not all allies. And your way of thinking is not our way of thinking. It's actually, I would argue, very well done in that respect. To me, that's an up. We then shift locations and we follow Michael Burnham and Philippa Georgiou down on this planet where they're going to, gently skirt General Order 1 in order to get the Corpusculans their water. It's a fun introduction to these two characters. And again, nothing happens in isolation. So we knew that this was a series that was not going to follow the captain. It was going to follow the first officer. So Sonequa Martin-Green, she finished up on The Walking Dead and came over and played Michael Burnham. And I cannot heap enough praise on her. Obviously up for Sonequa Martin-Green, because not only was she the first non-captain focal character of a series. All previous ones, your starring role was the captain. But she was also, in a way, similar to Kate Mulgrew. She was now leading a new show on a new streaming service that was a complete and utter experiment after a fallow period for Star Trek as well. That's a lot of pressure to put on one performer's shoulders. Every single account of this person that I've read is that she's lovely. There are some times you think people, they can crack under pressure. I can certainly crack under pressure. I know. Stop it, I know, you can barely believe it. Every single interview, every interaction seems to be that from the jump, she had everyone's backs. That in a way, that shouldn't affect the character. The person who plays them is really, really nice. Okay, great. Maybe they play a horrible character. But no, on top of that, there is this character that gets labeled with responsibility that is not hers. And that, I think, when you have not the captain, a woman, a black woman at that, a new streaming service, a new Star Trek that looks very different, and it is quite a darker start to a Star Trek as well. The abuse that was sent toward both Sonequa Martin-Green and Michael Burnham from the initial moment was ridiculous. What on earth? You'd swear she broke into each and every one of your houses and held you at gunpoint. Yeah, obviously I'm not trying to make light of that, but I am trying to highlight the ludicrous response to Michael Burnham. And yes, there is racism in that. And yes, there is sexism in that. And then there's also just pure pig-headedness in that as well. Not that those two things aren't pig-headed. And I remember, again, it was only 8 years ago, but I remember all of that being all over the internet before we hit play. And suddenly I'm seeing this character and I'm like, she's cool. What's your problem? What's going on? What's the issue here? So, Michael Burnham is a good character. Did some things go a little bit far, a little bit over-telegraphed? Yes, of course they did, as does every version of Star Trek. Some people forgot that this was the pilot episode. Encounter at Farpoint, nostalgia glasses aside, it's not a great episode. Emissary, good episode, not amazing. No one knew what they were going to do initially from the jump. I would argue that the Vulcan Hello is as close to what Discovery would settle into as nearly any of the Star Treks up to that point. I suppose that's my little rant, if you like, aside. But because of the, kind of frustration. To this day, I mean, you mention Star Trek Discovery and you will have people clickety-clackety, and you're like, Grant, every single person is entitled to their opinion. Every one of them. I'm not in any way suggesting that they're not, okay? And you are allowed to like whatever you like. Again, not here for that. It's the disingenuous, bad faith nonsense that, we have to sift through when you mention Discovery. And unfortunately, I know that on this video, we are going to have people giving out about the fact that we're covering Discovery, the fact that Michael Burnham gets an up. I guess I'm a bit tired of that nonsense because that's bad faith and that's not engaging with any kind of decency, if I'm honest with you. Michelle Yeoh is an absolute up in this episode, and of course, many things have happened with Michelle Yeoh ever since. She's won an Oscar since this episode came out. And I have plenty to say about that, but I'm going to leave that to the temporal observations. But, Philippa Georgiou, Captain Philippa Georgiou, as played by Michelle Yeoh, absolutely an up from me. There is an obvious sense of familiarity between these two characters. There is a tiny bit of, the sort of, if you like, we have to do a little bit of exposition. We have to explain that they've served together for 7 years and they know each other very well. But I will say it's handled mostly well. There is, kind of like, you were raised by the Vulcans and you have a Vulcan shield around you and kind of like, yes, okay, I'm getting backstory. But it is on the lighter side. It's not too heavy. They find this well, they shoot the rock bed, we get the water up, everyone's happy out, and away they go. Whoopsie doodle, they're lost. Well, that's not good, is it? If only they could find a way for their ship to find them. Up. Before I get there, you're like, wait a minute, Sean. Up for the Corpusculans. The increased budget and the advances in CGI allowed, pretty much from the jump, us to introduce less humanoid aliens. Look, I love me an Andorian, don't get me wrong, but a lot of the time in previous Star Treks, obviously you're somewhat hampered by what you can do initially, practically, The Excalbians look great, it's still a guy in a suit. We never got our rock monsters in Star Trek V because the effects just weren't there, and so on and so on. And here, you get from the right, okay, it's clearly a sentient alien running around and, it's got tentacles closer than it's got arms. And it looks good. And that's the kind of thing I like. I like my Star Trek to be out in the galaxy. That's one of the things I really did enjoy about, frankly, the budget increase. But yeah, particularly the VFX. We get, again, a little bit more backstory. We learn that Michael Burnham is a xenoanthropologist. We know that, if they were trapped on this planet, she would try and ingratiate herself with the locals. Georgiou was like, cool story, I'd try and escape. Which is what they do, because they create the massive Star Trek Delta on the sand, which allows the Walker-class Shenzhou to fly through the storm to beam them up. You were showing off what you can do with the VFX, and I like it. It's funny, actually, there's a bit of disagreement. I quite like the Walker class. It's not a beloved ship. I think there's a lot of opinions about everything. But it is the first example of sort of the design change with the lack of rounded nacelles. And this was apparently, a deliberate, it was a rule going into this show. They weren't just going to do the rounded nacelles again that had been on nearly every ship before that. I do like the designs of ships, but this to me would fall under change for change's sake. Because in temporal observation, but in Discovery, Enterprise happened. Jonathan Archer was there, the NX-01 was flying around. And so that design aesthetic was present in the 100 years before Discovery. Can design change? Absolutely. Look at the 60 years of Star Trek. Design changes all the time. Again, but when you've raised your flag to say, we're the prime timeline, we're the prime timeline, we're the prime timeline, and then you introduce kind of change for change's sake, because we can, that's when I do tend to stand with people who say, were you just doing it to kind of get a rise out of people? They obviously weren't doing it to just get a rise out of people, but there didn't seem to be a progression of logic in designs. When, spoiler, we would see the Enterprise arrive much later on, you can see the progression there from the NX-01 to the Enterprise. And then kind of going into Strange New Worlds as well, you see that lineage, that progression there. So it seems like for however many years in the middle of the 23rd century, some designer came on and said, we're gonna go wacky, that's it. this is my Picasso of ships. And that's what they did. And I guess, look, everyone has that second difficult album period. So yeah, that's my rant on the ships. One thing that I really do like is the update of the transporter design, and you see them literally breaking apart in the transporter beam. That's an up to me. The opening credits, they threw me the first time I watched them. I was very used to seeing, kind of your Voyagers, your DS9s, your next gens, whereas this was all sort of, it was more animated. And then I think, well, the Enterprise, even that kind of largely used footage stitched together. Now, when I say they grew on me, they're clearly beautiful, and clearly a lot of work went into them, and you can see the overall updating of the bits that go into the Discovery. The theme is lovely, Jeff Russo, taken up Jeff Russo. Where I have a down for the opening credits is there's a bit of a logic bump for me, is that we have, as it turns out, 2 episodes before we go into the story of the Discovery. I know contracts play a point in this, but starring Sonequa Martin Green, Doug Jones, Wilson Cruz, Anthony Rapp, Mary Wiseman, Jason Isaacs, none of whom are in the first 2 episodes. Shazad Latif. Do you remember when they tried to kid us that Shazad Latif wasn't playing a Klingon? That was good fun. I enjoyed that. And of course, the death knell for any opening episode, special guest star Michelle Yeoh. Before I knew anything about Burnham, I was like, she's not sticking around, is she? They do try, and I think throw a bit of a red herring in when Georgiou says, we must discuss you getting your own command. I think I had a moment of, oh, so we're doing something like Cisco, introduced as a commander and promoted to captain, just maybe in a shorter time span. Oh, okay. Yeah, it turns out that's not what they were doing. I like Burnham's log. We get the fact that it's May 11th, 2256, which is a Sunday. So that to me is an up. But I will say I have a down for all of the praise I've heaped on the aesthetics and the VFX. I do not like that warp effect. There's a couple of things later on. These are obviously aesthetic choices. To me, it was a bit kind of hard to see what was going on. We arrive basically straight into the bulk of the story, which is a Starfleet communications beacon has been damaged. The Shenzhou has been assigned to go and investigate it, and we get a bit of a round robin of, we get introduced to characters, ones who will come back, ones who won't come back. We do meet Doug Jones as Saru, goes without saying, Saru gets an up. We love Saru, even though early Saru was a bit too frosty. He was a little bit too, Again, a bit of context is important here as well. Another thing where Georgiou keeps an informal bridge. Not that there are no rules and no regulations, but what she does do is people tend to smile, quite frankly, on the bridge. And that's not something that we would see a lot of in Discovery as it goes on. The tone gets darker. But here in the beginning, I believe this is a crew who has served together and who know each other. Saru is very much of the opinion, let's buck it out of here, right? We're at the edge of Federation space. We are on our own. We should not be here. It's alluded to several times throughout the episodes that the Shenzhou is not the most powerful ship in the fleet. In fact, Georgiou out and out says it's one of the older models. And that was when Burnham arrived on the ship 7 years previously. So there is a suggestion that, the Shenzhou at this point in time could be almost as old as the Enterprise was in the search for Spock. It strikes me that there is a confidence that the Federation has at periods of history, particularly Starfleet, where, we will boldly go out there. And it's actually something that Kral says in Star Trek Beyond, that sometimes the frontier pushes back. And that is something that I think the logic behind sending the Shenzhou, not the most powerful ship in the fleet, out to investigate this thing on the fringes of their territory, it shows a little bit of overconfidence, and there is a massive consequence because of it. Few shots that zoom up into the bridge, because the bridge of the Shenzhou is on the underside of the saucer section. That to me is an up. The uniforms are an up, but not the asymmetrical size of them. I've never really loved that. I don't like the collars, and I don't like the way they changed the delta. That is a personal preference, so to me it is a down. But overall, the design of the costumes, I'll get back to the costumes because we're gonna talk about the Klingons a little bit later on. When Burnham is discussing with Saru whether or not they should go and investigate. You know, there's something out there that they can't quite see. Saru is very much of the let's leave. Burnham's like, come on, we're here. We can't not look. She goes in to speak to Giorgio in her ready room. And I do quite like Giorgio's ready room. It obviously gets repurposed a few times throughout the course of the show, but we're introduced to it here. She's got a telescope set up against the window. She's got set dressing. She's got books. I think somewhere in there's a bottle of Chateau Picard. It's good fun. It doesn't feel lived in, I will say that. It's not quite as utilitarian as, say, Archer's was on NX-01. There is a definite scale difference between the Shenzhou and the NX-01. But again, 100 years have gone by. And, you know, look what we would get on the Next Generation and onwards and onwards. Not that the ready room was huge, but the rest of the ship was. But I do like it. You immediately, you know you're on a Discovery era ship as soon as you see the aesthetic. For good or bad, but I do like how this one comes across. Burnham, she is there to discuss the mission with Giorgio. She is there to discuss Saru's worries. She's also there to say, we need to have a look. They can't scan this thing that's out there, so they come up with this idea, well, let's use our eyes, which I love, taken up. You know, our scanners aren't picking it up. We've got a telescope right there. And I really, really like it. There is one thing. Now, it's when you find out more about the Kelpians that this doesn't make as much sense. So I am going to give it a down. Saru wouldn't have needed that telescope. And it becomes quite a plot point as the show goes on. So here, unfortunately, the out continuity doesn't really work. He's looking through the telescope, oh, I can't make it out. Saru would have been able to see that with 3 bulkheads in the way. Again, you get the difference between Saru and Burnham here when Saru describes it as lurking this thing. Burnham's like, why must you assume ill intent? To which he kind of goes, why must you assume positive intent? And I like the interplay between these two characters. So Burnham says, right, give me a thruster suit and I'll go and get it. Then, Saru says, it would cause your DNA to unravel like noodles. That isn't up to me. But then Burnham claps back with something that seems a bit unfair. When Shira says, being afraid of everything means you discover nothing. Like, being afraid of everything is a Kelpian core part of who they are. That's a down, because that seems like a very pointed and, quite frankly, offensive thing to say to Saru. He, quite frankly, can't help it at this point. Burnham wins the day and says that it would be irresponsible to leave whatever is out there unknown. So she gets kitted up in this thruster pack that looks light years ahead of any of the technology we've seen before. Temporal observations. But I do like when you have Ensign Connor comes over the comms and says, okay, we'd like to welcome you to your non-stop flight to this unknown beacon. We're predicting a smooth flight. Again, these people know each other. Up. Again, beautiful. Burnham flies through the accretion disk of these 2 binary stars. Guess where they got the name from. And, heads towards this unknown object. You can feel the show flexing its VFX here. It does look stunning, to be fair. We get, playing with ups and downs because there is no ups and downs in space. The bridge could be on top of or underneath the ship, and it's fun. So yes, Burnham is actually, she's the other way around than everyone else on the ship as she flies toward it. It looks fantastic and it's aged quite well. Another thing that I like here is that she fires the thruster pack and, your camera pans out and we see her hurtle through space. But from her point of view, it doesn't look like things are getting closer for a moment because space is big. Up. She's flying 2,000 kilometers. That's how far away the Shenzhou is from what we will discover to be the beacon. And she's doing it very, very quickly. But, it looks great. So she arrives and she says, I can't remember who said that sculptures are crystallized spirituality, which is a great phrase. And the look of this beacon is gorgeous as well. She lands on it, engaging her magnetic boots, which triggers movement on the beacon. It's quite similar, I think, the way it opens up to the way the Scimitar's wings open in Star Trek Nemesis. And for a moment, things look gorgeous, things look fantastic. And then she turns around and says, oh, that's a big old Klingon there, because we recognize the Klingon emblem. Up to the uniforms, and particularly this EV suit that the Klingons are wearing. I mean, it is gorgeous, it's intricate, and you can really see the sheer amount of design. My earlier point about, different for different sake, I'm also going to apply here to the bat'leth. I think the bat'leth that was introduced in the Next Generation, at least on one side it's safe, so the wielder is not about to get stabbed by their own weapon. Here, everyone's screwed, whatever way you hold the bloody thing. So I do not love the design of the bat'leth here, so for me, it's a down as to how the bat'leth looks. And in a way, I was right. She triggers the thruster, knocks it forward, and kills him. Pink blood. Finally. Up. Back aboard the Shenzhou, people are starting to worry because, we can't, where is Burnham? We've lost her. And then her signal shows up moving away from this displacement field. Great, beam her back, can't. We've got no signal. You better get me a signal. Again, not to belabor a point. These people know each other. They care about each other. And eventually, Burnham does move back inside transporter range, and they were able to beam her back in, and she is very badly irradiated, because that was the thing. 20 minutes was a lethal dose, so she just escaped by the skin of her teeth. While they're rescuing her, this dead Klingon is brought aboard the ship of the dead, as we will learn it to be called. The inside of this ship is beautiful, taken up. I believe that things like cathedrals were inspirations for this design. It's absolutely stunning. Down calling the Klingon Redjack. Redjack is such a specific name in Star Trek history. I suppose you could say that there's nothing to say that this Klingon wasn't possessed by Red Jack, or Jack the Ripper, as we might know him. But I did think, what an odd thing to name the torchbearer. To me, it stuck out like a sore thumb. I like that we have little nods like, the Klingon roar for the dead, and the sarcophagus is lifted up to adorn the ship as well. So all of the ritual is there that ties in with, what we sort of understand about Klingon culture. That bit I quite enjoy. Odd choice for the name of that Klingon. We get a flashback to Burnham's youth, where she's in some of those learning pods that we saw in the first Kelvin film. We get our introduction of Sarek. I'm gonna say up to James Frain for this. I really, really like Mark Leonard as Sarek. And, he would still be the first one I would think of when I think of Sarek. But both James Frain and Ben Cross in the Kelvin films, I like what they brought to the role. And we do get a bit of James Frain as Discovery goes on. But I believe in the relationship, as formal as it is, between Sarek and Burnham. I'm leaving the big connection for temporal observations, obviously, because we will have to discuss that family connection. But aesthetically, I like how it ties back in. I like how we establish her youth and that she grew up on Vulcan here, but she's still haunted by a trauma visited by Klingons on her in the past. She wakes up in this sort of regeneration chamber, for want of a better word, and then, she interrupts it because she has to she finds out it's been 3 hours. So she runs out, and she runs into Jonathan from 30 Rock. Dr. Anton Nambu is played by Maulik Pancholi, who I have been watching quite a lot recently on 30 Rock because I'm just watching it for the first time. So taken up, nice to see you. She runs through the ship, arrives on the bridge, as Saru states, in an irradiated state, and said, "Philippa, there are Klingons." There is a little bit of back and forth, but there is a moment between Burnham and Georgiou of understanding, and Georgiou orders a red alert. And that to me is a team that works together. That is an up. There's a question of tactics. Georgiou is adamant that they're in Federation space, they're not withdrawing. Saru is like, we are in no state to fight anyone. Klingons or even a particle of space dust, the Shenzhou is not designed for combat. So Burnham comes up with the idea of, why don't we make them think that we're going to fire on their beacon? And Georgiou's like, well, hang on, we're not firing it anyway. She's like, no. We'd make it look like we're gonna fire and see what response it triggers. And it triggers a response because the Klingon sarcophagus ship decloaks in front of them. The effect of the ship decloaking and the design of the ship itself is an up. It is, however, at this point in the episode, because of the light coming from the binary stars, and because of all of the space dust and the debris and everything, I have to say I have it down because things start to become a little less clear. And I'll be honest, I was fortunate enough that I was, watching this on quite a nice screen there a few minutes ago. And even with super duper high res, there is something I miss about the sharpness that we saw in previous Treks. And I know like the logic of the ships are always brightly lit in the middle of space. Okay, there is a logical gap there. So it is obviously, again, aesthetic change. And it's something that continues on through Strange New Worlds, through Picard, and it is something that I think is maybe not great for the look of the ships, because I want to see them in as clear a relief as possible. On board the Klingon ship, T'Kuvma, having mourned, if you like, the death of Redjack, looks for another torchbearer. Redjack's brother steps forward and says, actually, I'm not really sure I'm with you on this one. And I like that. That even here, out at the edge of space, in this cult, which is what it is, he doesn't have blind loyalty. And although, yes, we then we get introduced to Vok, who will become the torchbearer, among other things, there are characters within these Klingons. And God love the actors. This makeup is not easy to act through, and it's certainly not easy to speak through those teeth, but you can see them standing out even here in this moment. It's also one of those things that, like, Vok, to prove his Klingonliness, puts his hand over a candle and lets himself get burned. Don't do that, you're going to weaken yourself, you fool. Back on board the Shenzhou, I feel like we're going ping pong between the two ships, but Burnham is all healed up and comes to the bridge, and Saru is adamant, we have got to get out of here, we've got to withdraw. Burnham says, well, we can't, we've engaged. And she's absolutely right. This is, as Georgiou points out, this is Federation space. If they tuck tail and run, that is an invitation for anyone to encroach on their territory, no problem. At this point, the engagement is hopefully going to be diplomatic as opposed to combat. Saru, we get this speech about, I am, on my world, there are only two ways of being, predator and prey. I was bred to be prey, and I'm biologically able to sense the coming of death, and I sense it now. It was a big moment in the trailer, and it's a big moment here. And Burnham doesn't brush him off. And she does go and speak to Georgiou, and she brings his concerns to Georgiou. She doesn't just say, okay, sorry about you. None of that happens. Again, because this is a crew that works together. Before she can speak to Georgiou is in the middle of a meeting with Admiral Brett Anderson. Admiral Brett Anderson is getting a whopper of a down from me. Because first of all, he's a big meanie to Burnham. He is not aware of all of the facts. So when he turns around, as soon as she walks in the door and says, you might think twice before effectively messing with another culture's stuff. Okay, it's not like she meant to. So that was a completely uncalled for comment. He calls the Klingons a warrior race, but then chastises her for saying, combat is the ideal outcome for any Klingon. It is in their nature. And he says, you're making assumptions about their nature. As he just did, to which she counters, be careful not to confuse race and culture up. Georgiou and Burnham discuss the mood outside. Burnham, as I said, brings the Saru's concerns in. But Georgiou makes the decision they can't do anything because they are seemingly the last line of defense at the moment. The rest of the fleet is on the way, but there's colonies nearby that they can't just abandon. Georgiou, not Burnham, makes the choice to stay. The scale is elevated when suddenly the beacon is lit. How that's presented is pretty great. And then the next thing, we get this holographic communication from the 24 Klingon houses. We will also have a holographic communication with Sarek as well. Flickering holograms can go do one. I've never liked the look of them, and I am sticking to that now. Starfleet, fix your tech. I would maybe I would make allowance for the Shenzhou as an old ship. Unfortunately, spoiler for Temporal observations, nope, that's just how they do holograms in this show. Burnham contacts Sarek, who says, the timing is interesting. The word is that there's a new star in the quadrant. And Burnham pretty much gets straight to the point, tells him what happened. Sarek says, considering the Klingons killed your parents, one might argue that your killing of a Klingon seems only fair. Bit cold, taken up. Again, there's logic to it as opposed to emotion. And it helps to highlight their relationship. But again, she cuts through it The Vulcans had diplomatic relations with the Klingons for years. How did they do it? Well, don't assume it'll work the same. Shut up. How did they do it? Burnham gets her answer. And here's where the giant debate around Discovery really kicks in. Oh, Burnham started the war with the Klingons. First of all, she absolutely did not start the war with the Klingons at all. What she does do is potentially mishandle how to present the information that Sarek has given her to Georgiou. She barges onto the bridge and says, "Captain, we have to fire first. Just fire first. That's the only way." And then she's so locked in that she does not allow for the time to explain. Not that, again, you might have too much time on the bridge, but this is a bit different. And as Georgiou says, Starfleet does not fire first. And Burnham would know that. So when Georgiou pulls her into the Red Room and says, "How dare you challenge me?" She's absolutely right to put her up on that. Now, Burnham is right in what she's bringing to the captain, just not in the way that she brought it. She sort of goes around and says, "This crew is ready for battle," and then Georgiou counters with a really powerful statement. She says, "Battle is not a simulation. It's screams and blood and funerals." There's a statement that's only managed to get more poignant with time. There was possibly a moment where Burnham could have convinced Georgiou, but she doesn't get there. Georgiou says, "Look, we'll find another way," and Burnham, this is where the fuel is thrown on the fire, is Burnham elects to overpower Georgiou, perform the neck pinch, go out, order the attack. Saru is absolutely right to call her on this because obviously they disappeared into the ready room together. She came back on her own and ordered an attack. Georgiou walks out, phaser in hand. All of this is an understandable reaction from Georgiou and from the crew. Then the light switches off and the rest of the Klingons arrive. Oops, we've really got to figure out what to do now, because it looks like the moment for firing first has passed. We move now into Battle of the Binary Stars, and I actually have to say I've got it down for right in the heat of emotion and battle, we kind of get a flashback. And it's Burnham's arrival on the ship. Also, respect is earned as is friendliness. Down. I've seen Vulcans, well, obviously she's not a Vulcan, but I've seen Vulcans be a little bit more open than that. I do even Sarek says, "Behave." It's a bit too, okay, you're very Vulcan. This is a bit hard. But Georgiou, brilliant in this scene, brings her on a bit of a tour of the Shenzhou. We get our context that the Shenzhou is an older ship. It's got lateral transporter technology. And we see that Saru was there the day Burnham arrived as well. Burnham is shown the bridge. So that feeds into how we know that they've worked together as long as they have. And it also helps inform some of Saru's shock at her actions too. Jumping forward then to present day, 24 Klingon ships have arrived, one for each of the 24 Klingon houses. Burnham is relieved of duty, and that is the right call. I'm sorry, but it is. Her intentions were good, and her logic was possibly sound, but her execution was off, and you cannot blame Georgiou for making the decision that she does. Burnham is sent to the brig. This brings us into, now, the opening credits of episode 2. Then we get a little bit of a flashback with young T'Kuvma on board the Klingon ship of the dead, which turned out to belong to his father. It was, he didn't like the fact that there was kids playing on it, desecrating it, and he gets, the snot kicked out of him. And that has obviously put him in such a complex, he is obsessed with Kahless and the return of Kahless, and he now believes that he himself is the reincarnation of Kahless. And the faithful around him believe in that too. He has to try and convince the 24 houses to follow him. One person who is not convinced is Call, played by the late great Kenneth Mitchell. Taken up. He played several roles throughout Star Trek Discovery, and he just, again, another one of those people that every single description of him, he was such a wonderful, wonderful guy. And unfortunately, he suffered from ALS, and he passed away a couple of years ago. But yeah, he played 3 Klingons and then played a human character as well. Yeah, he seemed like a lovely guy. One thing that is not lovely is listening to the Klingon language all the time. I get why they did it. We want to have a definite difference of cultures and everything at this point, but yeah, it gets a bit grating after a while. For the Whovians out there, you wouldn't do a whole episode of Daleks speaking to you, would you? Kind of feels a bit similar here. He convinces the Klingons to side with him by more or less predicting to the second when the Federation fleet would arrive. I do quite like most of these designs, I have to say. My criticism, if you like, of things like the nacelles, that's, we covered that with the Shenzhou, but I particularly like the Toplana Hath, the Kerala class. I really do like those. Obviously, I'm a little bit of a fan of the Cardenas class as well, because it's just cool. But yes, the Shenzhou's got its back up, and then they managed to get the Klingons' backs up by Georgiou signaling them and saying the one thing that unfortunately she shouldn't have said, but of course she was going to say, "We come in peace." T'Kuvma says, "I see your piece and I raise you a torpedo," and the battle begins, and it's brutal. I mean, it really is. They pulled out the stops for this fight. As much as some of the design, or the haze, if you like, is a bit hard to swallow, it looks awful. I mean, the ships get an absolute pasting. And this is where the Shenzhou's age really comes across. It is no match whatsoever for these Klingon ships. Burnham is trapped in the brig, unable to do anything about anything, while around her the ship is battered. You see the Toplana Hath being attacked by several Klingon birds of prey. You see other ships as well. Oh, yeah, it's a brutal battle. At one point, Saru says the shields are at maximum. We've just seen a torpedo go straight through. And I guess it's important to go, shields are at maximum, but it doesn't mean they're a match for the Klingon weapons. I do want to give an up for the design of the bird of prey, down for calling it a bird of prey. Again, it's again different for different sake. It is undeniably a beautiful design. But you say bird of prey, what's the first thing that comes into your head? It is the ship you saw in Search for Spock onwards. Ensign Connor, his console explodes in his face. He's ordered to go see the doctor, but he actually ends up in the brig. And we get, I think, an important moment, an important reminder in this, because it's also a bit of a mission statement for this is very wrong, where he says, "We're Starfleet, we're explorers, not soldiers." And he is then sadly immediately killed. I'm up not for his death, but for that reminder that yes, this should feel wrong. We don't want battles. We don't want war. That's not what Starfleet is about. It has been thrust into this by the Klingons. Thankfully, Burnham is saved from death by the fact that she's in the brig, because the force field around her is keeping her alive for now. I do have to down the logic of Sarek's Katra being in Burnham all this time. It is explained away that, she was a victim of a terrorist attack on a Vulcan installation, and he used part of it to keep her alive, and it was a bit, basically, it seems like jumping through hoops because we needed Sarek to be in the scene to give her a pep talk. And it was a bit overcomplicated, especially when we know about the Katra. The Katra is the Vulcan's soul, and it's a big deal to move it from person to person. So that to me just seemed like, are we buzzwording a little bit? But that aside, Sarek is able to give her a bit of a boot up the arse, because she was sitting there feeling a little bit sorry for herself. Slightly understandably, there is one line. "Do you think I would risk my well-being for sentimentality?" Hey, listen, if that's not Vulcan, taken up from me. And it inspires her to effectively have a conversation with the computer. Now, she's a prisoner, so the computer's like, "I'm not listening to you." And she manages to logic the computer into releasing her. It's a cool sequence, and it's also quite fun. So, she gets shot through a wee hole in the force field. She zooms across this whole breach and then into the corridor beyond. Thankfully, the computer opens the doors for her. Can you imagine the computer at the last minute was like, actually, no, I've changed my mind. Bang, fly away. Would have been a short series. But Burnham manages to now escape the brig. Meanwhile, Georgiou thinks that she's dead because that section took a direct hit from Klingon weapons. The Shenzhou, out of power, is drifting towards some debris, and then the Klingons just leave them to it because they're screwed. There's no power, they're going to be destroyed, and then they are saved by the Europa. So the Europa, with Admiral Anderson on board, has arrived. They engage the tractor beam, save the Shenzhou, and he hails the Klingons and effectively says, "Right, let's cease fire and let's talk about this." And T'Kuvma says, "All right, I agree to your ceasefire. That's no problem at all. hangs up the phone, turns around to the Klingons and says, "Lest any of you think that I cannot render my ships invisible." And then we get the introduction of the Klingon Cleave ship. It is effectively a flying sword in space. It flies directly into the Europa, tearing through, which results in the death of Admiral Anderson, and the Europa chooses to self-destruct to hopefully disable the Cleave ship, and it fires out a whole bunch of escape pods. So people do survive, but is it bloody silly? Yes, it is. It is very silly. It's like, oh, we have a big sword in space. But was it also cool? It was cool. Just a little bit. And I mean, I have to say, that one looks fantastic as the Cleave ship is decloaking. You see the hull of the Europa buckling and bending as it's being pushed inward. I would not like to have been on the Europa during that. That sequence is an up from me. Do you know what isn't an up from me, though? Down, T'Kuvma, you have no honor. You hid a ship and you lured them in. That is not honorable at all, git. T'Kuvma then broadcasts a message to all of Starfleet as the rest of the Klingons begin to disengage and leave the battle. I mean, the battle is done. In this message, he makes it very clear that, it doesn't matter if they're at the edge of territory. The Klingon Empire does not wish to know Starfleet, but Starfleet will know them. I really think he took out the teeth for this one because he's so much easier to understand here. It doesn't sound like he's trying to chew a bunch of marbles trying to get his message across. Burnham arrives on the bridge after a bit of an exchange between Saru and Georgiou because they're trying to think like, hang on, how can we shut down this Klingon ship? Saru comes up with the idea of maybe hide a photon warhead in some debris, get close enough, attach it to the hull and attack the ship. I like Georgiou just goes, it's devious. I like it. And yeah, in the heat of that kind of battle, I would like that too. But Saru raises the little problem that, the transporters aren't working and the autopilots on the worker bees aren't working. Of course they aren't, because we need them to work, just like every other bloody away mission in Starfleet. It's like, hey, how's it going, transporter? We need it to work right now? Yeah, broken. Anyway, so Georgiou says, we won't need the autopilot, I will be piloting it. My head, I'm going, that's why it said special guest star, okie dokie. Then what they notice is that the dead bodies that are floating in space of the Klingons are being retrieved by the Klingon sarcophagus ship. They start to come up with a bit of an idea, which would be attach the photon warhead to one of them and have the Klingons do the work for them. Burnham arrives on the bridge at this point, and there you can see in Georgiou's face, she is genuinely happy to see her. She thought she was dead. And Burnham makes a lot of sense because she explains, if you kill T'Kuvma now, after he's just started effectively a jihad against Starfleet, he instantly becomes a martyr and you will swing people around to his cause. If you capture him and shame him, that's very different. Then you'll be in a position to make, demands, but also to negotiate. Burnham feeling responsible, although I really don't think she is, but feeling responsible offers effectively to go over to the ship and capture T'Kuvma. Georgiou clearly isn't going to let her do that alone. So the plan becomes they will beam a photon warhead onto the body of one of these Klingons being retrieved, and then once the ship is disabled, then they will beam over and capture T'Kuvma. So far, so good. Before they go anywhere, there is one exchange that I think is critical as to why Burnham, I think, feels some of the guilt that she does later on. Georgiou asks her, how could you have done this? And I don't think she's talking about, she's not talking about hostility with the Klingons. She's talking about directly Burnham betraying her. She does commit mutiny, that is true. And she did perform a Vulcan neck pinch on Georgiou. That's not in debate. And you can see Georgiou's pain. And Michelle Yeoh sells the hell out of this, and that's an up from me. But so too is Burnham's reply, that she allowed her emotions to overtake her logic. That saving Georgiou, saving the crew, became more important. That too is an up from me, because it's very Starfleet. Very, very Starfleet. The plan with the warhead works. They basically blow the neck off the Klingon sarcophagus ship. Looks a bit spectacular. And there we go. Burnham and Georgiou beam over. Their phasers are set to stun initially, and they start taking down some Klingons. Vok, the torchbearer, he takes out Burnham and they begin a bit of a fisticuff battle, and it looks pretty brutal. I mean, the first thing he tries to do is kind of crush her head. Isn't it fun how relationships start? But meanwhile, across the room, Georgiou and T'Kuvma begin fighting, and it very quickly becomes hand to hand. Unfortunately, this does not go the way most Star Trek episodes do. T'Kuvma gets the upper hand, pulls back his mek'leth, and plunges it into Georgiou's chest. Burnham, having managed to disable Vok by stabbing him in the eyes with her thumbs, grabs a phaser, sees it happen, and in the heartbeat of a moment, sets her phaser to kill and shoots T'Kuvma. Bugger. This, to me, is a very effective depiction of the horrors of war. You know, you have so many battles throughout Star Trek where there's generally a triumphant feeling about it. They're always the good guys, or for the most part. And there's kind of a lot of times we all come home again. And of course, not always the case. Look at Best of Both Worlds, look at Tears of the Prophets, things like that. But then here, it's so much more visceral. It's so much more, I feel like I can smell the room that they're in. Hearing Burnham's cry as she tries to reach Georgiou's body, but Saru correctly says, if the captain is dead and your mission is failed, we're bringing you home. And he beams her back, and her breakdown on the transporter pod feels so real. Like, that scene isn't up. But overall, again, I don't think this will be any shock, Sonequa Martin Green is my Latinum up for these two episodes. So much of Discovery rests on her shoulders. And right from the beginning, you can see that they are safe shoulders to rest on. The rest of the episode then, she is on trial for her actions of mutiny, and I have a whopper of a down. She gets sentenced to life for mutiny. What? I struggle to reconcile that with the Starfleet, I know. And then the episode ends. So I guess it's time to join me at Temporal Observations. Let's get right into it. Spock. Okay, so Spock is not in these episodes at all. But before the show aired, we were told that Michael Burnham would be the adopted sister of Spock. And there was uproar. Absolute uproar. Why did this new character have to be introduced? How did she fit into the timeline? We made a big point of making it the prime timeline. Where did she fit in terms of Cybok? And these episodes do not give us any kind of explanation whatsoever. We only really get that she is connected to Sarek. As the show went on, particularly obviously season 2 when Ethan Peck arrived playing Spock, we do get slightly more of a context. She was saved from a Klingon attack. She was the only survivor that we knew of. She was raised on Vulcan by Sarek and Amanda. And, as we get to the end of season 2, a reason was given as to why Spock never mentioned her before the original series. Not to sound like, oh, I'm contrarian, but he never mentioned Cybok before Star Trek V. So I wasn't massively worried about kind of like, all right, okay, so there's another family member, but I was worried about how they were going to handle it. And I think for the most part, when you have the full picture, I think it works. But I absolutely understand that initial, hold on, what? In a way, I think it is quite connected to the aesthetic changes, the Klingon changes, the new feel. There is discussions from here to the end of the Earth about, should this have looked like the original series or should it have had its own one? I hear all of the arguments. I personally don't mind the aesthetic change. I'm not massively hung up on that. But I'm also not going to say you're wrong for liking the original series. Not at all. We had the original series aesthetic in Enterprise and In a Mirror Darkly, which ties back into Discovery. And, we also had the original series bridge in The Next Generation. We had the, Trials and Tribulation, and so on and so on and so on. Although I'm not too massively hung up on it, I actually do respect people who get frustrated with that because it does make it harder to go, this is the one universe. A lot of thematic things in Discovery do tie in very well with Star Trek. I mean, look at the way that the Klingons are handled. You know, this idea of segregated houses, of uniting under one beacon, of the whole idea of Kahless the Unforgettable. That, to me, actually, I thought was a really clever way of why did this war happen? Because we know in Star Trek history, there was a war between Starfleet and the Klingons. Errand of Mercy resulted in the Organian Treaty. So that, definitively ended any hostilities for a long time between Starfleet and the Klingons. But there had been a war behind it, and it was a devastating war. And so here, Brian Fuller, who was with himself and Alex Kurtzman, they, created Star Trek Discovery. It was a super interesting period of Star Trek history to visit. Do I love prequels? Wouldn't have been my first decision. I, much like many other people out there, I maybe would have preferred something to be 24th, 25th century onwards. Lower Decks, Prodigy, Picard. I get why they were doing it. Try and do a bit of a blank slate, fresh start. Look, same kind of feeling about the Kelvin film. There are some great nods, like for example, it's 2256 at this point, so Burnham references General Order 1, which would become the Prime Directive, so that was a nice little connection there. Alexander Courage's theme is played as the Shenzhou descends down through the clouds, and I like that as well, because Jeff Russo's theme does include that original series sting at the end of it, and I have come to love it. Initially, I thought it was two very different pieces of music that maybe didn't go together so well, but I've come to enjoy that. The thruster fact is very obviously a reference to Star Trek the Motion Picture, with Spock's spacewalk and Kirk going to get him. Before that, I mentioned about Saru's vision, so this doesn't tie in to what we then learn about Saru in the second season. He's able to identify the Red Angel from many miles away. Alright, okay. If I'm being kind, this thing was 2,000 kilometers away. So right, maybe I'll be kind about that one and say it was just a bit outside of his visual range. There's lots of little nods and references to the wider Star Trek universe in these episodes. Hatoria, Gamma Hydra, Andorians. I did like, obviously the USS Shran is part of the fleet, and so is the USS Tiplana Hath. So there are lots of references to the wider universe of Star Trek. Donatu 5, Doctori Alpha, those Vulcan learning pods. So for as different as Discovery is and feels sometimes, you can also see that there is a very concerted effort to make it part of the wider Trek universe. And funny enough, if we actually skip all the way forward to Star Trek Prodigy, when Hologram Janeway is giving the kids a little bit of a history lesson, a Crossfield class starship, the USS, well, maybe not the Discovery itself, but a Crossfield class starship is included in that, kind of this lineage of ships. There are ships in Starfleet that, we look back at, like, what is this? No, the Antares class was in the animated series. I'm trying to think of retroactive inclusions. Starbase 6, for example, in the remastered original series, that was created for the remasters as opposed to in the 60s. Things like that. Look, there's examples here and there of, just because we didn't see them doesn't mean they weren't there. The Eaglemoss and Fanhome series of ships have also highlighted, we didn't see that one, but that's a nice model there. We get Live Long and Prosper, we get all sorts of Vulcan nods, but overall, I think these two episodes, they do a great job of setting up what Discovery would be. Even though, as we go forward in Discovery, each season feels almost like a soft reboot. Season 2, with the arrival of the Enterprise, Spock, Pike, number 1, there seems to be quite a definitive push to maybe bring it a little bit closer into established Star Trek history. The end of season 2, then seemingly accounting for what we'd seen the previous 2 seasons. Season 3, then they jump to the future, that itself is a soft reboot. Season 4, things have changed again. And then season 5, which I was really fond of, actually. I really quite like season 5. But here in season 1, particularly in these first 2 episodes,
I think it's one of the stronger pilots in Star Trek history. I really do. Because it didn't have the fallback that some of the other ones did. Caretaker had Emissary, Encounter at Farpoint, Beyond the Farthest Star, and, well, the 3 pilots, if you like, for the original series to fall back on. Enterprise took a swing. We discussed it last week about some stuff I think worked and some stuff I think didn't. This one, entirely new aesthetic. Now, they set their own barriers, don't get me wrong, but entirely new aesthetic, entirely new style of storytelling, complete and utter gamble in would people show up. I've got to give it props for that. I really, really do. Without it, we wouldn't have Picard, Lower Decks, Prodigy, Strange New Worlds, and the upcoming Starfleet Academy. I think Michelle Yeoh as Captain Philippa Georgiou was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. I personally never warmed to Emperor Georgiou. I struggled with the character in season 1 and 2 and 3 of Discovery, and I certainly struggled with the character in section 31. However, I think that overshadows just how good she is as Captain Philippa Georgiou in these 2 episodes, and she was in the short trek as well. So again, kind of, sometimes you see the whole body of something and you're like, well, hold on, but you look back and you go, actually, that was brilliant. And that is something that, despite what followed, that really, really worked. Hi, I'm Duncan Rillick, no relation, and I collect relics from before the burn. Thanks to a temporal wormhole, I now have an unlimited supply of TrekCulture t-shirts, and I'm selling them to you! You could be wearing this stylish down and up t-shirt. Or, how about this fish watching design? Bright yellow on black, the colors I'd use in thumbnails, I tell you that for nothing. I plan to take these designs and transfer them via quantum duplication onto hats, mugs, and posters. So look out for those. Ah! Treat this unlimited supply as a limited time deal. Get your t-shirt quick. Who's your daddy? And that is going to bring us up to date for everything there. So folks, thank you so much. I hope that you enjoyed going back through Discovery as well. Now, as it stands, we have all the ups and downs from seasons 3, 4, and 5 of Discovery. We don't currently have any other episodes of seasons 1 or 2, but do let us know if that's something that you would like to cover on the channel. We would be very happy to look back through those seasons. And I hope that you've enjoyed this exploration of the Vulcan Hello and Battle at the Binary Stars as well. Next week, we're going to be looking at Remembrance, the pilot episode of Star Trek Picard. Similar, I personally was not here for the first season of Star Trek Picard, and we did things a little bit different back then. So we're doing a fresh ups and downs for that episode. I hope you will join us for that. Until then, folks, make sure that you're following us on the various socials. We're at TrekCulture or at TrekCultureYT on Instagram. I am at Sean Ferrick. Eddie is at e.d.r.u_. It's going to be on the screen. Eddie has the best flipping username ever. But you are awesome. You are wonderful. Make sure that you live long and prosper. Whatever you do, if you're having a discussion or a disagreement with someone, keep it respectful. I mean, there's nothing wrong with disagreeing, but let's just make it a conversation as opposed to a fight. To everyone out there who is going through hard times, you are not alone, and you will never be alone, even if it doesn't always feel like that. And I really hope you remember that and you take that from this. To our friends in the Sudan, in Congo, and in Palestine, please know that all of our hopes are on a peaceful end to what is happening. This world is but we will get through this. I firmly believe that, and I know that you can help make that happen. But look after yourself as well. Folks, thank you so much. I will see you next week. Cheers.